Welcome to this lesson of the Polgar Chess University. In this lesson, I'll tell you about weak squares, outposts, and then a different theme, how important the activity of kings are in pawn endgames. And then, of course, finally, a miracle in chess. So let's start out with a very basic example of weak squares. In the position we see on the screen, it's quite obvious that the dark squares around black's king are real weak. Also, the fact that the white queen is already on f6, it smells danger. And of course, the fact that white has a dark squared bishop ready to come for action is really scary. Nevertheless, white needs to figure out how the bishop can help the queen. There are two options. One is to go bishop to c3, and the other one, bishop to h6. This is a perfect example how important accuracy is in chess. There is a big difference between moving the bishop to c3, which seemingly creates scary threats along g7 and h8. In reality, it's a big mistake because black is able to block that threat by pushing the pawn up to d4. Let's get back to the beginning position of this endgame and look for the correct move, which is bishop to h6. Now the queen and the bishop work together perfectly to take advantage of the weakness in black's position, that is the g7 square. Well, let's switch to a tactical, immediate, justifiable attack like that against the dark squares, which involves checkmate, to something a lot more positional. In this position, there is no immediate tactic, and here we're gonna talk about a more positional sense of what is a weak square. There won't be an immediate attack on black's king, but simply to improve our position little by little. First of all, what are weak squares? Weak squares typically we consider squares that cannot be guarded by a pawn. On the other hand, the other side would have control of that square by at least one pawn. Well, which square is that for black in this case? Which square is weak in black's position here? It is the d5 square. At the same time, which square would be weak in white's position? That would be the d4 square. Now, ideally speaking, we would want to have a knight on this weak square on d5. However, it's quite hard to imagine how this knight from f3 could get to d5. It would take quite a few moves. The knight, on the other hand, on a4 could get there quicker, but its route seemed to be blocked. It cannot move to c3 because of black's pawn, and it seems if it goes to b6, the black queen stops its way. However, this is a perfect example when we're using a tactical element to accomplish our strategic goal. This is a famous game between the legendary American world champion Bobby Fischer against Johannesson. Fischer continued with knight b6 nevertheless, because if the queen captures the knight, then a checkmate follows by queen to d7. In the game, black played bishop e7, developing, getting ready to castle, and the knight achieved its dream square on d5. It's very common that that piece, that knight, that occupies that key weak square could potentially be traded for another knight or bishop, which is equal value. What usually happens in such situations is that the other side recaptures with a pawn and creates a protected passed pawn. Protected passed pawns are especially powerful and dangerous in endgames. In this case, white is threatening to push the d-pawn, creating an immediate fork. The white queen is attacking the black pawn on a6, and also the black backward pawn on c5 became an immediate target. Therefore, white's position would be clearly superior here. Black did not trade, but moved the queen to c6. And here, white starts a regrouping. It's ideal to have rooks on the open files, and even if we want to have our queen there, it's typically better to have our queen behind our rook on the open file than the other way around. And that's exactly what Fischer is trying to accomplish in the next couple of moves. So white managed to double the rooks, and again, combining strategy with tactics, white has improved his position strategically, but at the same time also created a tactical threat, a discovery. If it were white's move again, white could, for example, capture black's pawn on f6 and then win the bishop on d6. That explains black's next move, moving the bishop away to b8 out of danger's way. So far everything is nice and beautiful, but white needs to improve the position further in order to win the game. The knight is very well placed on d5, but at the moment does not have any good moves. So white decided to improve the position of the other knight in the time being. Continued knight d2, queen e6, knight f1, black castled, and knight g3. So now the other knight is trying to get to another nice place, f5. It's true that's not considered a weak square by the same definition as the d5 square was. Why? Because black has a potential, after moving his knight somewhere, eventually to play g6 and chase white's knight out of f5. Nevertheless, in the meantime, the f5 square would be a great place for the white knight, because if black would play g6, that would weaken the position of the black king. Black here played knight f4, forcing some exchange. Black now attacks white's queen and rook. Therefore, white must capture, obviously not with the knight, which would result in losing material because of the fork on white's bishop and knight. White captured with the bishop, pawn captured back, and knight h5, putting another knight on the attack on the pawn on f4. And here black played inaccurately, played rook c to e8, counterattacking white's pawn on e4. It was better to do the same, but moving the other rook from f8 rather. White captured the pawn, bishop captured, knight captured, and queen captured pawn. And now an important move, rook e3. Now black has only one move, making sure they don't lose the rook on e8, moving the queen back to c6. Came rook e6, a strong move. Queen c8. And here came h4. An interesting idea, trying to provoke a weakness in black's kingside position. Black perhaps helped white by voluntarily weakening himself, playing g6. Came rook e7. When rooks get to the 7th rank, that can be extremely powerful. Black captured, white captured back, and now white is threatening to move his rook to d7 and then checkmate along the 7th rank, or moving his knight to e6. Black's position is pretty much lost. The last moves of the game were rook f7, rook d8 check, king g7, and knight e6 check, and black resigned. And now let's talk about a different subject. Let's move to pawn endgames. This is a very famous pawn endgame played by one of the endgame virtuosos, Akiba Rubinstein. About 100 years ago, this game was played in St. Petersburg, Russia in 1909. His opponent was Kohn. It's black's turn in this position, and it's very crucial that black immediately uses his king for the attack. As so often, isolated pawns are weaknesses, even though in this case the isolated pawn is all the way back on h2, which typically would be less of a weakness than if it would be somewhere in the middle of the board, more accessible for the opponent's king or pieces. But nevertheless, black can go on an attack. In fact, the king can go on an attack. A very important difference between the endgame and the opening or the middle game. In the endgame, the king very often is being used as a major attacking piece, unlike the other part of the game when there are still numerous pieces on the board. Usually we want to hide our king, making sure it doesn't get into trouble. So the correct move here is running to attack the pawn on h2. And of course, white needs to run to defend that pawn. And at first, let's see how the game itself continued. Both sides are running, black attacking, white defending that pawn on h2. And this means activity. The black king is active because the black king is the one attacking, while the white king is the one defending. And that's why the white king is in passivity. And now, black gains more space by advancing his pawns. Let's see what happens if white just sits and waits, what white did in the actual game. Game b5. White has not much of a choice but to sit and wait. And black, one by one, advances their pawns. And now, black offers the first raid. Here the game ended rather quickly. White played e4 in hopes that maybe black will blunder by capturing the wrong pawn, and then white would be winning, having an unstoppable passed pawn on the f file. Of course, black can do better. and black captured the pawn on e4. When white recaptured, Rubinstein played h4, king g1, and the key move g3. In this position, white actually resigned because, for example, if pawn takes, king takes, and the king simply moves to f3, simply picking up the pawn on e4 and winning easily the pawn endgame. But let's go back just a little bit, a few more moves, because things could have been more complicated than they actually were. In this position, when black just played g4, it was a bit tricky how to win if white would have captured on g4. H-pawn captures back, king g1, f4, pawn captures, and king h1. And this is a tricky position which in numerous endgame books they gave the wrong answer. It wasn't until the computers discovered the error of the old endgame books. The old book said that the correct move is to play g3, exchanging the pawns, and then the black king would simply run along the third rank and pick up white's a3 pawn. However, in reality, this position is a draw because after these moves, when the kings are coming close, in this critical position, white can save the game actually by playing a4. Look at that. If the pawn captures, the white king gets to the corner right on time. And as we know, a pawn endgame is a draw with a rook pawn that is an A or H pawn as long as the other side's king reaches the critical promotion square. In fact, even if black would have 2, 3, 4, or 5 pawns all lined up, double, triple, quadrupled, and so on the A file, the game is still a draw as long as the king gets to the corner. Remember this. So let's go back to the key moment. And we were talking about pawn takes, king g1, f4, pawn takes, king h1. So we just learned that what some books consider a win, pushing the g pawn, is not true. The correct answer here is playing f3. After king g1, the black king needs to get around because it cannot make any more progress at the moment on the king side. And now, after king h1, king g5, and the king is going around trying to go after white queen side pawns. If now white is trying to sacrifice a pawn to get counterplay, it's not good enough. King g4, king g1, king f4, king h2, because the black king gets around. And luckily for black, in this position, black has a little waiting move. If it weren't for that little pawn move, and the black king would have to move, then black would lose his pawn on f3 and eventually the game. But luckily for black, black had that waiting move. In pawn endgames, these little moves are extremely important, and that's a reason for a famous saying that the pawns are the soul of the game. Pawns don't move backwards. You have to be always very careful with pawn moves because you cannot take them back. Unlike all the other pieces that can move backwards and forward, it doesn't matter. Sideways, pawns don't. So that's why be very delicate with your pawn moves. Again, let's go back. And I would like to show you one more line. After pawn takes, king g1, f4, pawn takes, king h1, f3, king g1, king h4. And what happens if now the white king does not go king h1, but goes king to f1? Well, if the black king goes back to h3, of course that would be only a repetition of moves with the white king coming back to g1 defending the pawn. So black needs to look for something better. And here again the situation gets a bit tricky. White's idea is that if the black king goes to g5, then the white king would go to e1 and stop the entrance of black's king towards the queen side. Therefore, black needs to do something tricky here and play king h5. Kind of see and wait which way the white king goes. King e1, king g5. And this is the critical moment. If now the white king goes towards the queen side, then the king is coming back to the king side. And now the white king is too far to come back to protect the h2 pawn. And the king goes to e3, king h3, king f4, king h2, king g4, and after king g2, white's position is lost. On the other hand, if we go back to this position and the king does not go to d2, but goes back to f1, then the white king is too far from the queen side. And the black king gets to come all the way to c4. And now white can choose which way to let the black king in. White is losing the opposition. If the king goes to b2, then the black king comes into d3 and e2 and grabs the pawn on f2. Or if the king goes the other way to d2, then king b3, king e3, king captures a3, king f4, king b4, king g4, and black arrives first with the pawn promotion just on time to stop white's pawn from promoting. And the black queen is guarding the promotion square on h8, therefore white's position is lost. And just one more thing regarding this position, when we go back all the way to the starting position of this endgame, after king f6, king d2, king g5, what if the white king tries to go after black's queen side pawns and promote a pawn there? Well, white is a bit too slow. Let's check it out. King d3, king h4, king d4, king h3, king c5, king h2. Such endgames require calculation to make sure your pawn arrives first, before you would allow your opponent's king to go and eat up your pawns and promote his own pawn. As we can see, the black pawn arrives first, although the story is not over, because black cannot stop white from promoting his pawn. However, black can be ready that after white promotes the pawn to a queen, black can force the exchange of the queens, which with winning the game, because now the black king can eat up white's remaining pawns and then promote at least one of the pawns and win the game. A very interesting endgame, very instructional, but the main point is in endgames, especially pawn endgames, the activity of the king is very important. Whichever side is able to cross to the other side and gain space, more territory, usually has the advantage in pawn endgames that have equal number of pawns. And let's see another example for the same theme. This position is a game that was played in Germany in 1982 between Behrens and Storm. Again, in this position, the theme is the same, the activity of the king. Luckily for white, it's their turn, and therefore white manages to put their king in an active position. If black would be able to give a check now with a pawn without losing that pawn, black would be doing fine. But black is not able to accomplish that. As we can see, white succeeded in putting his king on the 4th rank, while the black king only got to his 3rd rank. From black's perspective, right? 8, 7, 6, so it is black's 3rd rank, so to say. Now black made an intent to try to play g5 on the following move and chase white's king black. But white has a very strong move here, preventing that idea. By playing h5, white is getting ready to meet g5 check with what? Can you figure it out? With en passant. That's right. Never forget about that option, right? En passant. And of course, when the king takes back, then the white king is ready to enter and attack black's pawns. First, the one on e6, but then after that, just go after black's queenside pawns and win the game. In this position, after h5 in the game, black played king f7. So after king e5, the king can move to e7 and for the time being, prevent the white king from entering on key squares like d6. Again, it's quite important to notice that white has a number of those little waiting pawn moves at his disposal. But first, white needs to improve his position. He played e4, forcing an exchange of 2 pairs of pawns. Now black played king f6, preventing the white king from coming back to e5. King f4, a4, trying to holding white's king off from the e5 square. But white also has a waiting move. And now black has no choice but move back with his king and let the white king come to e5 after all. And again, king e7, preventing the white king from coming to d6, d5, pawn takes, king takes, and king d7, stopping all the entry squares of the white king. But, very important point, white has a little waiting move, and black now has no choice, either moving the g-pawn, when white could just capture it by en passant again, or move the king, in which case the white king just enters and attacks black's king side pawns and wins the game. And finally, let's see a beautiful position which I call the miracles of chess. It's a pawn endgame also, composed by Olmuitsky in 1960. Looking at this position, the situation seems to be really tough for white because black has a passed pawn on the A file. How can we stop it? Can we stop it? Actually, we cannot, because we don't have any pieces that could stop it. We cannot hope for stalemate by putting our king in the corner because white still has a pawn on E2. That's mobile. So what could be the solution? Try to think and figure it out. I bet you'll get extreme joy when you find the solution. White to move and draw. And the solution is E4, A4, E5, A3. But why are we pushing this pawn up? Black will just capture that pawn. Well, white captures the pawn, A2, H7, and queen. Isn't this the same idea that we just saw before in one of the previous positions when the queen promotes and at the same time stops the promotion square? Isn't black just simply winning here? Almost. But here is the miracle. White can and should still promote the pawn to a queen because after queen takes queen, the position is stalemate. What a jewel, isn't it? Well, thank you for listening. Remember, watch out for weak squares. And of course, the activity of the kings in endgames are absolutely crucial. So long until next week.